Dating a drug trafficker is a dangerous affair. One wrong move can mean death, and more often than not, there is no way to make it out alive. But a Colombian journalist named Virginia Vallejo did it. She secretly dated the baddest of them all, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, at the height of his ruthlessness, and somehow survived to tell the tale. How on earth did she do it, you ask? Well, let's go back to Colombia in the 70s and 80s. The not-so-humble Rivera. To say her family had history would be a gross understatement. Her parental grandfather was a finance minister and a descendant of the family of General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, leader of the Californios that shaped the transition of California from Mexico to the United States of America. Her paternal grandmother was a descendant of Alonso Jaramillo de Andrade Céspedes, a nobleman of Extremadura, Spain, whose long lineage can be traced to the 1st century Roman Emperor Charlemagne. Virginia had Spanish senators on her mother's side and a great uncle named Jaime Jaramillo Arango, who was Minister of Education and a Colombian ambassador to several countries in Europe before, during, and after the Second World War. In 1967, when Virginia Vallejo was 28, she toed the traditional route of upper-class working women of the time and began working a discreet job as a teacher in the American Colombian Center in Bogota. However, Virginia already had streaks of rebellion, and one way she showed it was by refusing to get married. She eventually got married at 30 to a wealthy Colombian widower, whom she divorced 2 years later in 1971. Then, in 1972, she was offered a job that would launch her career in journalism. 1982, moments before the first meeting. In the final months of 1982, a violent war between Pablo Escobar and the government ravaged Colombia. Earlier that year, Escobar had gotten into politics and won a seat in Congress, but a justice minister named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla forced him to step down after outing him as a drug trafficker. Incensed, Escobar waged war on the government on 2 fronts. The first front was easy, as his sicarios assassinated the justice minister along with anyone who opposed him. But on the other front, the damage was done. The people of Colombia saw him as nothing more than a dirty criminal. So, Escobar began to hatch a plan. He needed someone who would help him win the hearts of the people, someone they respected and loved, someone who wasn't tainted by politics or crime and could repackage him as a hero of the working class. That someone was Virginia Vallejo. Virginia Vallejo and Escobar. The story of how Escobar stumbled on Virginia Vallejo is shrouded in uncertainty. However, we can establish one fact. In 1982, Virginia Vallejo was popular enough that there was no way that Escobar wouldn't have known who she was. The legend goes that Escobar had seen the gorgeous Virginia Vallejo showing off her legs in a famous pantyhose commercial, when one day he turned to his men and said, "I want that woman." He extended an invitation to her, and she accepted. This was before she would famously interview him the following year, in 1983. While it is very possible that Escobar had ulterior motives from the start, I'm inclined to believe that he was more interested in using Virginia Vallejo to revamp his image than he was interested in sleeping with her. He knew how influential she was and how associating himself with her would get the Colombian people to trust him. It was reputation cleansing by association, kind of like if Keanu Reeves were to suddenly go live on television and tell the world that Putin was actually just a misunderstood guy. You would be inclined to listen and give the Russian leader another chance because you like Keanu. It would help Putin's PR. In Escobar's case, it worked. Their interview happened in 1983, set in the slums of his home city of Medellin. Escobar flaunted the humanitarian projects he had done for the poor while answering personal questions from Virginia Vallejo. The drug lord suddenly looked more human than the political elite who mostly embezzled state funds and gave nothing back to the people. The interview brought the drug kingpin such levels of acceptance that the media began calling Escobar the Robin Hood of Medellin. The people fell in love with him. Escobar had won the second front of his war against the government. Ideally, this is where their story should have ended, but this was just the beginning. Because what started out as a transactional interview between Escobar and Vallejo would quickly evolve into a whirlwind romance. And in the period they were together, Vallejo not only became his lover, but also his confidant. He carried her to secret meetings and spilled sensitive secrets to her. Secrets he only trusted his inner circle of sicarios. Secrets that would eventually haunt everyone who had done business with the drug lord. Now, the big question that desperately needs to be answered is this: how exactly was she able to steal the heart of the cunning Pablo Escobar? At the time in Colombia, this career path had a stigma, a reputation that was so repulsive, no one from a respectable family was expected to associate themselves with it. Unsurprisingly, Vallejo's family were against it, but Virginia went against her family's wishes and accepted the job. There wasn't much competition at the time. In the whole of Colombia, there were only 3 television channels and studios, and they were mostly owned by the Colombian government, so it really was a small playing field. Virginia saw the opportunity and immersed herself completely. She became a presenter on one channel while training to become a news anchor on another, and in a matter of weeks, she went from a newbie to interviewing presidents and important personalities. Virginia Vallejo was everywhere, hosting TV programs, children's contests, cooking shows, musical shows, and eventually anchoring the news. In fact, it was the time she spent anchoring the news that made her Colombia's sweetheart. You must remember that this was a time when news anchors were like mini gods, because not many people had what it took to be on television. So, after 7 years devoted to her media career, Virginia tried to settle down once more. In December of 1979, she married David Stivel, a prominent Argentine television, film, and theater director. But once again, her marriage hit the rocks. They were separated in 1981, and for the next 2 years, a long, messy divorce would ensue. But that didn't distract Virginia from her career. During this time, she started her own television production company called TV Impacto, got invited by the government of Israel for a special program about the Holy Land, and was the only journalist sent by Colombian media to London to cover the wedding of Prince Charles and Diana of Wales in July 1981. It was also around this time that she began appearing in the famous pantyhose commercial that we mentioned earlier, the same commercial that attracted the attention of Pablo Escobar. So to answer the question of how Vallejo captured Don Pablo's heart, she was someone who went against the wishes of her family and was willing to do anything it took to dominate her field, even sleeping with and laundering the image of a drug lord that killed people. In other words, Don Pablo Escobar probably saw himself in Virginia Vallejo. Figuratively, of course. Her affair with a notorious kingpin. They fell in love with themselves after the infamous propaganda-like interview that Virginia Vallejo masterminded for the drug lord. According to her, she was charmed by him. After all, Pablo Escobar was a natural leader who was said to be charming and humorous. However, the reason she says she fell in love with him was because he was the only rich man in Colombia who was generous with the people, in a country where the rich had never given a sandwich to the poor. Yeah, the bar was that low. Meanwhile, Escobar helped her finalize her divorce with her ex-husband, and she moved into his villa, where for the next 5 years, she would live the life of a Colombian queen. She had unrestricted access to Pablo's jet. She met the kingpin in exotic hotels all over the world. Shopping sprees were unhinged afterthoughts, and more crucially, Escobar began to trust her so much that he opened up to her about how he and other drug traffickers had Colombian politicians in their pocket. The last part is very important, because the siege of the Palace of Justice happened just a year after they started dating, an event where on the 6th of November 1985, a rebel group launched an attack on the Supreme Court of Colombia and took justice members hostage. The president responded with military force, and the aftermath was 11 missing civilians and 98 dead people, including half of the 25 Supreme Court justices. It was one of the most devastating domestic terrorist attacks in Colombian history. However, 2 weeks before that attack, Vallejo was present with Escobar, the leader of the rebel group, and the president of Nicaragua at the time, as they planned the siege. She would later tell a courtroom that Escobar had told her that he paid $1 million in cash to the rebels, and another $1 million in arms and explosives to steal his files from the Palace of Justice, before the Supreme Court began studying the extradition of the leading members of the cocaine cartels to the United States. Another time, a former Minister of Justice named Alberto Santofimio begged Pablo Escobar in Vallejo's presence to eliminate a presidential candidate and sitting senator named Luis Carlos Galán. Years later, Galán would be assassinated, and many decades later, Vallejo's testimony against Santofimio would be his indictment. There is no doubt that Vallejo and Escobar's relationship was mutually beneficial. Virginia Vallejo's reputation as a prestigious journalist validated Escobar as a man of the people, and until today, he still has that reputation with many of the poor in Medellin. Everything beautiful comes to an end. In 1987, Escobar and Vallejo's relationship ended rather abruptly. No one knows for certain what happened, but according to Pablo's son, Sebastián Marroquín, his father cut ties with her when he learned that he was not her only lover. Sebastián says the last time he recalls seeing her anywhere near Escobar was outside the gate of his father's estate. She stayed there sobbing for hours because the guards had refused to let her in on Escobar's direct orders. This event is particularly interesting because you could ask why Escobar didn't kill her. She obviously knew and had seen far too much. I mean, he had certainly killed others for far less. Maybe he had too much on his plate at the time. From 1987 until his demise in 1993, Escobar was either locked up, on the move, or fighting a battle. There was no rest for the kingpin in the final years of his life. Or maybe he loved her so much that he decided to spare her life by shutting her out of his own. We will never know for sure. All we know is Virginia Vallejo found herself alone in the aftermath of their relationship. Her association with Escobar had hurt her career more than she could have anticipated. All of the respect she had before him washed away as the latter became enemy of the state number one. She was also shunned by the Colombian elite. She did try to make a comeback to Colombian media, but it quickly became apparent to her that time had passed. In 1993, Escobar was killed, and by 1994, Virginia Vallejo retired from the Colombian media permanently. A lot of bizarre things happened to her during this period. She took part in a multi-level marketing scheme, then got scammed by the founders to the tune of almost $30 million. She sued them but never got her money back, and after years of trying to get justice for herself, Virginia Vallejo turned her focus on a new agenda. In 2006, when Alberto Santafimio was brought to trial for the assassination of the presidential candidate many years before, she decided to testify in court the secrets that Escobar had told her so many years ago. She exposed just how rotten Colombian society was. She mentioned legitimate businesses that laundered drug earnings, the elite social clubs that opened their doors to drug lords, and the politicians who exchanged favors for Escobar's money. Then one day, the case was suddenly closed, and witnesses began dying around her. This is when she realized that she had to escape the country or she would become the next victim. She reached out to the American embassy in Colombia and asked the US government to grant her asylum in exchange for information on the associates of Pablo Escobar, including members of the Cali cartel who had been extradited to the US for a case in court that was happening the following month. The US accepted her request, and on the day she left Colombia, 14 million people watched Virginia Vallejo live on their television as she boarded a plane that would save her life. Today, she lives and works in Miami, Florida, knowing well enough that she can never return to her home country.